There is something deeply admirable about the older adult who gets up every single morning and exercises, rain or shine, stiff knees or not. That discipline, that commitment to health represents something genuinely good. And so what follows here is not a criticism of those individuals. Not at all. It is, however, a complication of the assumption underneath their routine. Because the assumption, for most people over 60, is straightforward. More exercise equals more health. Every day is better than 5 days. 5 days is better than 3. Rest is something you earn reluctantly, or something your body forces on you when it breaks down. And that logic feels intuitive. It feels correct. But the biology tells a somewhat different story. A study published February 9th, 2026, from the University of Birmingham, a group that has been doing serious work in exercise immunology for years, now presented findings that challenge this dose more, get more framework in a way that is difficult to dismiss. What they demonstrated in a carefully controlled cohort of adults over 60 was that a specific pattern of resistance exercise, not daily, not intense, not exhaustive, produced the most favorable changes in what they termed immuno-metabolic aging, 3 days per week, moderate intensity, with recovery built in as a non-negotiable biological requirement. Not a luxury, a requirement. And here is what makes this more than just another exercise study. The mechanism they identified was not about calories burned or cardiovascular fitness in the traditional sense. It was about muscle tissue functioning as something most people never think of it as an endocrine organ. A gland, essentially, releasing signaling molecules that directly influence immune function, inflammation, and cellular aging. That reframing deserves attention. So let's slow down and work through it carefully. First, this phrase, immuno-metabolic aging. It sounds technical, and it is, but the concept is not hard to grasp once you break it apart. What it refers to is the gradual convergence of two processes that accelerate with age. One is immune decline, the slow deterioration of immune surveillance and regulation. The other is metabolic dysfunction, the creeping inefficiency of how the body processes energy, manages blood sugar, handles fat storage, and maintains tissue repair. In younger adults, these systems operate somewhat independently, but in adults over 60, they become increasingly entangled. Immune dysfunction worsens metabolic health. Metabolic dysfunction worsens immune function. They feed each other. And the result is a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation that gerontologists sometimes call inflammaging. Not a dramatic infection, not a fever, just a persistent, quiet hum of inflammatory signaling that accumulates over years and decades, degrading tissue, impairing cognition, stiffening joints, and exhausting the very immune cells meant to protect the body. And this is where senescent cells enter the picture. A senescent cell is, in simple terms, a cell that has stopped dividing but has not died. It lingers. And while it lingers, it secretes inflammatory molecules, a cocktail sometimes referred to as the senescence-associated secretory phenotype, or SASP. These molecules are not benign. They signal neighboring cells to become inflamed. They recruit immune activity that, rather than resolving a problem, perpetuates one. Over time, the accumulation of senescent cells in immune tissue, in fat tissue, in the lining of blood vessels becomes a meaningful driver of age-related decline. The immune system itself is not spared. T cells, which are central to adaptive immunity, accumulate senescent populations with age. These aged T cells take up immunological space, so to speak, without contributing meaningfully to defense. They crowd out functional cells, they produce inflammatory signals, and they resist the normal clearance mechanisms that would, in a younger body, remove them. So the question becomes, is there anything that can nudge this system back toward better function? Not reverse aging, that language is irresponsible, but shift the balance, reduce the inflammatory load. Support the clearance of dysfunctional cells. improve the ratio of functional to senescent immune populations. This is where skeletal muscle becomes fascinating. Most people think of muscle as mechanical. It contracts, it moves bones, it provides strength and stability. And that is true. But over the past 15 years or so, exercise physiology has undergone a quiet revolution in understanding what muscle actually does beyond contraction. Skeletal muscle, when it contracts, particularly under resistance, releases a family of signaling molecules called myokines. These are proteins that enter the bloodstream and communicate with distant organs: the liver, the brain, fat tissue, and critically, the immune system. Now, take a careful look at the diagram on your screen. What you are seeing is a simplified representation of muscle fibers during resistance exercise. Notice the molecules being released into the surrounding capillary network. These are myokines, and among them, one has received particular attention in the immunological literature: interleukin 6, or IL-6. This is where nuance matters enormously, because IL-6 has a complicated reputation. In chronic inflammatory diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, for example, or severe infections, IL-6 is elevated and contributes to tissue damage. It is, in those contexts, genuinely harmful. But the IL-6 released from contracting muscle behaves differently. It is produced in a different context, through a different pathway, and it triggers a different downstream cascade. Muscle-derived IL-6, released during exercise, promotes anti-inflammatory responses. It stimulates the production of interleukin, 1,0 and interleukin, 1 receptor antagonist, both of which are anti-inflammatory mediators. It enhances insulin sensitivity. It improves lipid metabolism. And this is what the Birmingham group focused on, it appears to support the selective clearance of senescent immune cells. Context changes everything in immunology. The same molecule, produced under different circumstances, can have opposite effects. That is not a contradiction. That is biology. So here is the picture that emerges. Skeletal muscle, when appropriately stimulated through resistance exercise, functions as an anti-inflammatory endocrine organ. It cleans, in a manner of speaking, the immunological environment. It helps the body process and remove dysfunctional cells that are otherwise contributing to chronic inflammation. But, and this is the critical qualification, this benefit follows a dose-response curve that is not linear. It does not simply increase with more exercise. There is a window, a biological sufficiency point, and beyond that point, the returns diminish. In fact, they can reverse. This visual helps clarify how muscle tissue releases signaling molecules into circulation during moderate resistance work. Notice that the myokine output peaks during and shortly after the exercise bout, then gradually returns to baseline over the following 24 to 48 hours. That recovery period is not wasted time. It is when the immune system responds to the signal. It is when senescent cell clearance accelerates. It is when the anti-inflammatory cascade actually does its work. Skip the recovery, and you interrupt the process. Exercise again before the system has responded, and you are layering stress on top of incomplete adaptation. This is where cortisol enters the conversation. Cortisol is not a villain. Let's be clear about that. It is a glucocorticoid hormone produced by the adrenal glands, and in acute bursts, it is essential. It mobilizes energy. It sharpens focus. It modulates immune activity in ways that are protective during short-term physical challenges. An acute cortisol spike during a workout is normal, expected, healthy, even. The problem arises with chronic elevation. When an older adult exercises intensely every day, or even moderately every day, without adequate recovery, cortisol levels can remain elevated beyond the normal post-exercise window. And chronic cortisol elevation does several things that directly undermine the benefits exercise is supposed to provide. It suppresses immune surveillance. It promotes visceral fat deposition. It impairs sleep architecture. It degrades connective tissue. It inhibits the very myokine signaling that makes exercise immunologically beneficial in the first place. This illustration shows the cortisol pathway under chronic stress. Notice how sustained elevation leads to a cascade of downstream effects, including suppressed T-cell function, increased inflammatory cytokine production, and impaired tissue repair. This is not the cortisol response of a single challenging workout. This is the cortisol profile of someone whose body never fully returns to baseline because the next stressor arrives before recovery is complete. In geriatric medicine, it is often observed that the most fatigued older adults are not the sedentary ones. They are sometimes the ones who exercise relentlessly but never feel rested. Clinicians frequently notice a pattern. The older adult who walks 5 miles every morning or attends daily group fitness classes, yet reports persistent tiredness, joint achiness, poor sleep, frequent minor infections. The assumption is usually that they are not doing enough, or not eating well enough, or simply aging. The possibility that they are doing too much, that their exercise dose exceeds their recovery capacity, is rarely the first consideration. Consider a 68-year-old man, retired, health conscious. He walks 3 miles every morning, does a body weight routine 4 afternoons a week, and plays pickleball on weekends. On paper, this looks excellent. In practice, he sleeps poorly, his knees ache constantly, his energy crashes by 2 in the afternoon, and he has had 3 respiratory infections in the past year. His physician runs blood work and finds mildly elevated inflammatory markers, but nothing specific. He is told to keep up the good work. But what if the good work is, in biological terms, slightly too much work? What if his body is producing adequate cortisol suppression of immune function because it never gets the 48-hour recovery window that the Birmingham protocol identified as essential? This is not about discouraging activity. It is about dosage. And dosage, in medicine, is everything. The difference between a therapeutic drug and a toxic one is often nothing more than the amount and the timing. So what did the Birmingham group actually propose? Their protocol, and they were careful to frame it as a biological dosage model, not a fitness program, involved resistance-based exercise performed 3 days per week, with at least 1 full rest day between sessions. Monday, Wednesday, Friday was the structure used in the study, though the specific days matter less than the spacing. The sessions lasted approximately 20 to 30 minutes. The exercises were compound movements, meaning multi-joint patterns that engage large muscle groups simultaneously. Think of a squat pattern, a pressing movement, a pulling movement, a hip hinge, not machine-based isolation work, not endurance training, not high-intensity interval protocols, moderate load, controlled tempo, full range of motion where joint health allows, and then critically, rest. The rest days were not treated as unfortunate interruptions. They were built into the model as the period during which the myokine signal is processed by the immune system. The 48-hour window following a resistance session is when anti-inflammatory cascades peak, when senescent cell clearance is most active, when the adaptive immune system remodels most effectively. Exercising during that window doesn't double the benefit, it truncates it. The participants in the study, who followed this 3-day protocol for 16 weeks, showed measurable improvements in several markers of immuno-metabolic health, reductions in circulating inflammatory cytokines, improvements in T-cell receptor diversity, a marker of immune competence, improved insulin sensitivity, reduced visceral adiposity, and perhaps most meaningfully, for the individuals themselves, improvements in self-reported energy, sleep quality, and joint comfort. The group that exercised 6 days per week at similar intensity did not show the same degree of immune improvement. Their cortisol profiles were higher, their inflammatory markers were less improved. Their subjective well-being scores were, on average, lower. More was not better. More was immunologically counterproductive. Now, this needs careful framing. This does not mean daily movement is harmful. Walking gently, stretching, gardening, light activity, these are not the same as structured resistance training. The Birmingham study was specifically examining the dose-response relationship of resistance, exercise, and immune function. Gentle daily movement remains broadly beneficial and is, frankly, essential for cardiovascular health, mood regulation, and joint mobility in older adults. What the study challenges is the idea that structured, effortful exercise should happen every day in older adults, that recovery is optional, that fatigue should be pushed through, that more volume always produces more benefit. The aging body responds differently to stress. That sentence deserves emphasis. In a 25-year-old, daily intense training may be absorbed and adapted to relatively quickly. Recovery capacity is high. Hormonal resilience is robust. Immune rebound is fast. In a 65-year-old, none of those things can be assumed. Recovery takes longer. Hormonal responses are less elastic. Immune rebound is slower and more fragile. What constitutes an appropriate training stimulus at 25 may constitute a chronic stressor at 65. And chronic stress, regardless of its source, psychological, physical, metabolic, converges on the same pathways: cortisol, inflammation, immune suppression. It does not matter that the stress is exercise, which is supposedly good. The body does not evaluate intent, it evaluates load. Long-term metabolic research suggests that the individuals who age most successfully, who maintain independence, cognitive sharpness, immune resilience, and functional capacity into their 70s and 80s, are not necessarily the ones who exercise the hardest. They are often the ones who exercise consistently, moderately, and with adequate recovery. The tortoise, not the hare, but a tortoise with a structured plan. Notice how immune cells respond in this simplified model on your screen. After a moderate resistance session, there is a transient increase in inflammatory signaling, that is, the acute stress response, and it is normal, followed by a prolonged anti-inflammatory phase that peaks roughly 24 to 36 hours later. This anti-inflammatory phase is where the immune benefit actually occurs. It is where myokine signaling drives senescent cell clearance, where regulatory T cells are upregulated, where the immune system recalibrates. If you exercise again during that anti-inflammatory window, you restart the inflammatory phase before the anti-inflammatory phase completes. You override the benefit with a new stressor. And over weeks and months, this pattern produces a chronically inflamed, cortisol-elevated, immune-suppressed state that looks biochemically remarkably similar to the immuno-metabolic aging the exercise was supposed to prevent. That irony is worth sitting with. So what does a practical application look like? Not as a prescription that would be inappropriate without individual medical context, but as a general framework consistent with the evidence. 3 sessions per week, spaced with rest days between them, each session 20 to 30 minutes. Compound resistance movements, body weight initially, progress to light external loads as capacity allows. Squats to a chair, wall push-ups, progressing to standard, rows with a resistance band, hip hinges with light weight, controlled movement, breathing, no rushing, no competition, no gritting through pain. And on the rest days, gentle movement, a walk, stretching, light gardening, nothing that constitutes a significant physiological stressor. The goal on rest days is circulation and mobility, not adaptation. The beauty of this framework, honestly, is its sustainability. In adults over 60, the primary barrier to long-term exercise adherence is not motivation, it is burnout. It is joint pain from overtraining. It is fatigue that accumulates until the whole project feels unsustainable and is abandoned entirely. A 3-day protocol with built-in recovery addresses this directly. It is designed not only for biological effectiveness, but for practical longevity of the habit itself. And that matters more than any single workout ever could. Let me close with a broader reflection, because this topic connects to something larger than exercise prescription. The concept of biological sufficiency, the idea that there is an optimal dose of a stimulus beyond which additional exposure does not help and may harm, is one of the most important principles in medicine. It applies to medication, it applies to nutrition, and as this research increasingly demonstrates, it applies to exercise. The culture around fitness, particularly in the United States, tends to valorize extremes. More is better, push harder, no days off. And for younger populations with robust recovery capacity, that ethos may be tolerable, even occasionally productive. But for older adults, for individuals whose immune systems are already navigating the challenges of senescence, whose cortisol regulation is less resilient, whose joints and connective tissues repair more slowly, that ethos can be genuinely counterproductive. The Birmingham study does not tell older adults to stop exercising. Quite the opposite. It tells them to exercise with precision, to treat physical training the way a physician treats medication, with attention to dose, timing, and individual response. To respect recovery not as weakness but as the biological space in which adaptation actually occurs. Muscle is medicine, but like all medicine, the dose determines the outcome. If you are watching this and you are over 60, or perhaps you care for someone who is, consider having a conversation with a healthcare provider about exercise structure, not just exercise quantity. Ask about recovery. Ask about intensity calibration. Ask whether the current routine is producing the immune and metabolic benefits it should, or whether it might be exceeding the body's adaptive capacity. And if you are willing, leave a comment below with your age and how many days per week you currently exercise. Not because there is a correct answer, but because these conversations, the honest sharing of experience, help build a more realistic picture of how older adults actually live with exercise and how that picture aligns or conflicts with emerging research. If this discussion was useful to you, sharing it or subscribing to this channel helps it reach others who might benefit from the same information. That is all. No urgency in that. Just the simple mechanics of how educational content finds its audience. The body is remarkable in its capacity to adapt at any age, but it adapts best when the demands placed on it are thoughtful, measured, and respectful of its current state, not the state it was in 30 years ago. That distinction, small as it seems, may be the most important insight the Birmingham study offers. 3 days, moderate resistance, real recovery, and the patience to trust that sufficiency, not excess, is what the aging immune system actually needs. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves thoughtfully.